A retired Navy SEAL bought an island nobody could live on. Then his K9 found something beneath it still running. A Navy SEAL bought an impossible-to-sell island. His dog found the reason nobody lived there. Ethan Cole wanted 14 lonely acres in the Idaho mountains where his nightmares couldn't follow. But on their first night, Ranger refused to cross the cabin door. Then the ground began breathing warm air through frozen soil, and Ethan realized the island's 37-year secret was still alive. Before we go deeper, comment 1 if you'd trust Ranger and 0 if you'd leave the island. And tell us where you're watching from. At 3:11 every morning, Ethan Cole woke before the nightmare finished. It had been that way for almost 2 years. He would open his eyes in darkness, one hand already gripping the edge of whatever bed he happened to be sleeping in, his heart pounding as though his body had arrived somewhere his mind had not. Sometimes it was a $40 motel room beside a highway. Sometimes it was the reclined driver's seat of his battered pickup. On the worst nights, he woke to the smell of dust and hot metal that existed nowhere except in his memory. That November morning, Ethan woke in room 8 of the Pinecrest Motor Lodge outside Clearwater Ridge, Idaho. Rain tapped against the window. The heater rattled beneath it. For several seconds, Ethan stared at the ceiling and listened. He counted the sounds automatically. Heater, rain, a truck passing on the highway, nothing else, then something warm pressed against his hand. Ranger stood beside the bed. The 8-year-old Belgian Malinois had a pale scar beneath his right eye and the beginnings of gray around his muzzle. One rear leg remained stiff from an old blast injury, but there was still something unmistakably alert in the way he carried himself. Ethan slowly opened his hand. Ranger pushed his head beneath it. "I'm here," Ethan whispered. He wasn't sure whether he was speaking to the dog or himself. By 6, they were back on the road. Ethan had once been a Navy SEAL and a combat diver. He had worked in places where decisions were measured in seconds, and mistakes followed men home in flag-covered boxes. A damaged shoulder and blast exposure had eventually ended that life. The paperwork called him medically retired. Civilian life had proved harder to name. He could repair an outboard motor in freezing rain. He could rebuild a generator from parts scattered across a workbench. He could still read terrain almost without thinking, but put him in a crowded grocery store with shopping carts striking one another behind him. And sometimes his hands began to shake. At diners, he chose the booth facing the entrance. If somebody stood too close behind him in line, every muscle across his shoulders tightened. On the 4th of July, he drove Ranger 30 miles into the mountains before sunset. People sometimes expected PTSD to look like anger. For Ethan, it usually looked like planning his entire day around things other people never noticed. Ranger noticed. He always did. That morning, Ethan stopped at a small diner near Lake Blackwater. He chose the rear booth with a clear view of the door and ordered coffee, eggs, and toast. Ranger settled beneath the table. A waitress dropped a tray near the kitchen. The crash came without warning. Ethan's fork stopped halfway to his mouth. The room seemed to shrink. His breathing changed. Nobody else paid attention. Ranger did. The dog rose beneath the table and leaned his shoulder firmly against Ethan's shin. Ethan looked down. Brown eyes stared back at him. "Yeah," Ethan murmured. "I know." He counted 4 slow breaths. The diner became a diner again. That was how they lived now, not dramatically, not heroically, one ordinary moment at a time. 2 weeks earlier, a disability claim that had spent years moving through appeals had finally been resolved. Combined with the sale of the last belongings Ethan still kept in a storage unit, tools he didn't use, furniture from a house he no longer owned, boxes he had avoided opening. It left him with enough money to make a choice. Friends might have called it a second chance. Ethan wasn't ready for language that hopeful. He simply wanted somewhere quiet. He looked at apartments first. Too many walls shared with strangers. Then houses. Too many neighbors. He drove past one subdivision where 6 identical garages faced the street and children played basketball beneath decorative lamps. Nothing was wrong with it. That was the problem. It belonged to a life Ethan could no longer imagine himself living. 3 days later, he walked into the Clearwater Ridge County office to ask about remote land. The building smelled of old paper and wet coats. A bulletin board beside the records counter displayed tax notices, timber parcels, foreclosure auctions, and properties nobody had bothered removing in years. Ethan almost walked past one faded sheet. The photograph stopped him. An island sat alone in dark mountain water. Behind it rose the snow-covered Selkirk Mountains. The photograph was old enough that its colors had begun turning blue. At the center of the island stood a cedar cabin surrounded by tall pines. Ethan stepped closer. Raven Rock Island, 4.2 acres, boat access only. Cabin sold as is, $28,500. Ethan read the price twice. Something wrong with it? The woman behind the counter looked up. She was in her early 60s, with silver-streaked hair and reading glasses hanging from a cord. Depends what you consider wrong. Her nameplate read, Margaret Ellis. Ethan pointed toward the listing. 14 acres in the middle of Lake Blackwater for $28,500? Margaret studied him before answering. You looking for an investment? No. Vacation property? No. What are you looking for? Ethan glanced through the rain-streaked window toward the mountains. Quiet. Something in Margaret's expression softened. Then she noticed Ranger sitting beside him. That's a serious dog. He's retired. Police? Navy. Margaret looked back at Ethan. She understood enough not to ask the next question. Instead, she removed the island listing from the board. Come with me. She led Ethan into a records room where metal cabinets lined the walls. Several minutes later, she returned carrying a thin property folder and an aerial photograph. Raven Rock Island was shaped almost like an arrowhead. Most of its 14 acres were covered in pine and granite. The cabin stood on the southeastern shore. A collapsed wooden dock reached into a narrow cove. There were no neighboring houses, no power lines, no bridge. Across the lake, the nearest ranch lights would be more than a mile away. Ethan felt something inside him loosen. How long has it been listed? Margaret hesitated. Depends where you start counting. Try the beginning. First listing was almost 37 years ago. Ethan looked at her. At that price, it wasn't always that price. Why hasn't somebody built on it? Somebody always thinks they will. Margaret opened the folder. 4 names appeared on separate transfer records. 4 owners. The first had kept Raven Rock for 11 months. The second lasted 7. The third sold after 14 weeks. The fourth had owned it on paper for several years but stopped visiting before the first winter ended. Taxes are current, Margaret said. Title can transfer. Cabin isn't condemned. No zoning dispute preventing residential use. Then why did they leave? Margaret closed the folder. That's the question everybody asks before they buy it. Ethan waited. Margaret sighed. Headaches. He frowned. Headaches, that was the most common complaint. One owner reported dizziness. Another said his wife became disoriented after spending several nights there. There were complaints about generators failing for no obvious reason. Batteries dying. Strange sounds under the cabin. Animals, maybe. Water. Nobody proved anything. Ethan looked again at the aerial photograph. What aren't you telling me? Margaret's eyes settled on the northern end of the island. In January of 1996, a caretaker named Robert Hale disappeared. From the island, that's where he was living. Body recovered? No. Boat. Still tied to the dock. Ethan's gaze sharpened. Winter. Heavy snow. Lake was partly frozen. Search teams figured he went onto the ice or fell from the rocks, but you don't. Margaret folded her hands. I file records, Mr. Cole. I don't solve mysteries. That answer told Ethan more than a denial would have. Outside, rain became sleet. Drops struck the window and slid down the glass behind the image of Raven Rock. Ethan had spent years searching for places where his nervous system might finally stop fighting battles that were already over. And there it was. 14 acres of trees and stone, water on every side, mountains beyond that, no traffic, no hallway footsteps outside a motel door, no strangers behind him in line, no one asking when he planned to get his life together, no one asking whether he missed the Navy, no one telling him he should be grateful to be alive. Just an old cabin, a broken dock, and enough distance from the world to hear himself think. What would it take to buy it? Margaret stared at him. Did you hear anything I just said? Every word. 4 owners walked away. I'm not them. A man disappeared. Nearly 30 years ago. You don't know what's wrong with that place. Ethan looked down at Ranger. For the first time since entering the records room, the Malinois was no longer watching the doorway. Ranger was staring at the aerial photograph. Ethan noticed it immediately. Ranger, the dog's ears moved forward. Margaret watched as Ranger stood. He approached the table slowly and sniffed along its edge. Then he lifted one front paw. Ethan expected him to put it against Ethan's leg. Instead, Ranger placed the paw directly on the photograph. Northern end of Raven Rock Island. Margaret went very still. Ethan looked from the dog's paw to the dark patch of forest beneath it. What's up there? Margaret shook her head. Nothing. Ethan continued looking at the map. Ranger did not move his paw, Margaret corrected herself. Nothing that's supposed to be there. Outside the county office, Lake Blackwater disappeared behind a curtain of November sleet. And for the first time in years, Ethan Cole felt something stronger than the urge to keep moving. He wanted to know why nobody else had stayed. By noon the following day, Raven Rock Island belonged to him. The transaction happened with so little resistance that it almost bothered Ethan more than if someone had tried to stop him. The seller accepted $2,800 without a counteroffer. Margaret Ellis walked him through the county paperwork twice, making sure he understood the cabin was being transferred as is, that the island had no municipal utilities, and that winter access across Lake Blackwater could become dangerous without warning. When Ethan signed the final page, Margaret held the deed for an extra second before releasing it. You can still change your mind. Ethan took the paper. I've done enough of that. Ranger sat beside his chair, watching Margaret. She looked at the scarred Malinois. Maybe listen to him if he tells you something. Ethan almost smiled. I usually do. The purchase consumed less than half of what Ethan had managed to put together. The rest disappeared quickly. He found a 16-foot aluminum skiff behind Frank Dawson's marina, its paint faded and its benches scarred by years of fishing gear. The outboard motor coughed when Frank started it, then settled into a rough but steady idle. It's ugly, Frank said. So am I. Frank glanced at Ranger. Dog's better looking than both of us. Ethan paid cash. By late afternoon, the skiff held fuel cans, a portable generator, hand tools, plywood, rope, lanterns, canned food, bottled water, a first aid kit, winter blankets, and 2 large bags of Ranger's food. He bought only what he needed. Years in the military had taught Ethan that possessions became weight surprisingly fast. 2 mornings later, Lake Blackwater was smooth enough to cross. The sky was pale silver when Ethan backed the skiff away from the marina. Ice rimmed the shaded edges of the dock, and the first heavy snow of the season rested high on the Selkirks. Frank stood with both hands inside his coat pockets. "Weather turns, don't argue with the lake," Ethan nodded. "And keep that radio charged." Another nod. Frank looked toward Raven Rock, barely visible through morning haze. "If you hear something strange out there, don't decide what it is before you know." That made Ethan look at him. Experience talking? Age. Frank untied the stern line. "Sometimes they're the same thing." Ethan pushed the throttle forward. Clearwater Ridge slowly fell behind them. Ranger stood near the bow, balanced easily despite the old stiffness in his rear leg. Wind flattened the fur around his neck, while his nose worked continuously. The farther they traveled, the quieter Ethan became. The marina shrank, then the diner, then the highway. Ranches along the southern shore became scattered red barns and pale fields divided by dark fence lines. Smoke rose from distant chimneys. Beyond them, the Selkirk Mountains climbed into clouds, their upper slopes white with snow. For Ethan, the distance felt physical. Every 100 yards across the lake seemed to remove something from his shoulders. No motel doors slamming, no televisions through thin walls, no engines outside at 3 in the morning. Only water striking aluminum and the steady growl of the outboard. Raven Rock appeared gradually, first the pines, then granite, then the cabin. The island looked darker than the surrounding shoreline, crowded with tall evergreens whose trunks rose almost straight from broken rock. On the southeastern side, an old cedar cabin sat above a narrow cove. The dock was worse than the listing photographs suggested. Half of it had collapsed into the lake. Ethan reduced speed. "Home sweet home," Ranger looked back at him. "Don't judge it yet." They landed beside the broken dock. Ethan stepped into ankle-deep water, pulled the skiff onto the gravel, and tied it to a pine. Ranger jumped ashore. The change in him was immediate. His nose dropped. He moved through the trees with controlled curiosity, checking the shoreline, brush, and rocks before circling back to Ethan. No alarm, no hesitation. Ethan noticed. For the next several hours, they worked. Or rather, Ethan worked while Ranger inspected his new territory. The cabin had one main room, a small bedroom, a crude kitchen, and a stone fireplace that needed cleaning before Ethan trusted it. Mouse droppings covered one cupboard. Moisture had warped part of the floor. A chair had collapsed beneath its own weight. But the roof was mostly sound. The walls were solid cedar, and through the front windows, Ethan could see miles of water. He opened every window. Cold mountain air swept through the cabin. He carried rotten furniture outside, swept years of dust from the floor, patched one section of the porch, and cleared enough debris from the dock to make unloading easier. Nothing dramatic happened. That was exactly what Ethan wanted. By mid-afternoon, weak sunlight broke through the clouds. He sat on the porch steps with a metal cup of coffee warming his hands. Ranger explored the forest edge. Ethan watched the dog disappear between the trees, then reappear 20 yards farther north. For once, Ethan wasn't checking exits. There was only one boat, his boat. Nobody could walk up behind him. Nobody could knock on the motel wall. Nobody needed anything from him. The silence around Raven Rock was enormous, and strangely, it did not feel empty. It felt safe. Ethan closed his eyes. Water moved against the shore. A raven called somewhere across the lake. Wind passed through the pine canopy. His shoulders lowered. He hadn't realized how high he had been carrying them. "Could get used to this," he said. Ranger returned from the trees and sat several feet away. Ethan looked at him. "What?" The dog stared back. "You're the one who picked the north end of the map." Ranger scratched behind one ear. Ethan laughed quietly. It surprised him. The sound seemed unfamiliar. Near sunset, the temperature dropped sharply. Ethan carried the last supplies inside. "Ranger, come." The dog approached the porch. Ethan held the door open. Ranger stopped. "Come." Nothing. Ethan frowned. The Malinois stood at the threshold with his front paws inches from the doorway, inside. Ranger's ears angled forward. He looked past Ethan into the cabin, then back at him. Ethan waited. During years of working together, Ranger had entered aircraft, vehicles, tunnels, ruined buildings, and places shaking from explosions because Ethan had asked him to. He did not casually refuse commands. Ranger Ethan's voice became firmer. Inside, the dog leaned forward enough to smell the air. Then he stepped backward. Ethan's expression changed. "Okay." He crouched beside him. "What have you got?" Ranger did not appear frightened. No raised hackles, no growl. His attention remained fixed on the cabin. Ethan checked the doorway, then the floor. He smelled damp wood and old dust. Maybe rodents, maybe mold. Ethan entered alone. He searched more carefully this time, behind cupboards, under the bed, inside the fireplace. Nothing. He checked the floor for rot and the ceiling for nests. Still nothing. Ranger remained outside. Ethan decided not to force him. "Suit yourself." He returned to repairing a cabinet beside the kitchen. The work absorbed him. 10 minutes passed, then 20. Around the half-hour mark, Ethan rubbed his forehead. A dull ache had formed behind his eyes. He stood and stretched his damaged shoulder. The room shifted slightly. Ethan steadied himself against the counter. He hadn't eaten much. That was probably it. He drank water. The headache remained. Then came the metallic taste. Faint at first, like he had bitten his tongue. Ethan ran it over his teeth. No blood. His right hand began trembling. He stared at it. And something cold opened inside his chest. Not here. He knew the sequence. Tremor, short breath, pressure behind the ribs, the mind searching for a threat the room could not see. Ethan closed his eyes. "You're fine, scratch." His eyes opened. Scratch, scratch. The sound came from the front door. Ranger. Ethan crossed the room and opened it. The Malinois immediately backed away, then returned and pressed hard against Ethan's legs. Ranger moved again, several steps down the porch. Then he looked back. Ethan didn't follow. Ranger returned, pushed against his knee and moved away again. "You want me outside?" Ranger stared at him. Ethan stepped off the porch. The dog kept moving, across the small clearing. 20 feet, 30. At the pine line, Ranger finally stopped. Ethan leaned against a tree. Cold air filled his lungs. The metallic taste began fading. He noticed it after perhaps 5 minutes. After 10, the headache had weakened. The shaking stopped. Ethan straightened. His eyes went to the cabin. One dark doorway, 2 windows reflecting the lake. Nothing moved inside. He looked at Ranger. The dog was calm now. Ethan walked toward the cabin. Ranger followed until they reached the porch. Then he stopped again. Ethan climbed one step. Ranger remained below. That was when Ethan understood the distinction. Ranger had spent the entire afternoon roaming Raven Rock without concern. He had walked the shoreline, the forest, the granite ridge, the dock. There was only one place on the entire 14-acre island he refused to enter: the cabin. Ethan looked through the open doorway. The fading sunlight reached across the warped floorboards and stopped near the old stone fireplace. For the first time since buying Raven Rock, the silence felt different. Not peaceful, watchful. Ethan turned toward Ranger. The Malinois was no longer looking at him. His eyes were fixed on the floor inside the cabin. And very slowly, Ranger lowered his nose toward the threshold. Ethan watched him for several seconds. The dog drew in the air once, then again, separating scents the way he had been trained to do years earlier. His nose moved along the bottom of the doorframe, but his paws never crossed it. Something under there? Ranger looked up. Ethan turned toward the cabin. He wanted to pull the floorboards immediately. That instinct came from an older version of himself, the man who believed every unanswered question should be approached before it had time to become a threat. He stopped. One of the hardest lessons civilian life had forced on him was that instinct and certainty were not the same thing. His body had warned him of dangers that weren't there before: a shopping cart striking a metal shelf, a truck backfiring, a stranger reaching suddenly into a coat. Those reactions felt every bit as real as the warnings that had once kept him alive. So Ethan had developed a rule: when possible, verify. Not tonight, he told Ranger. He opened the windows wider, collected his sleeping bag, lantern, and water, and carried everything outside. They slept beneath the porch overhang. Or Ethan tried to. Lake Blackwater disappeared into darkness until the island seemed surrounded by nothing at all. Across the water, a handful of ranch lights glowed like distant stars. Wind moved through the pines in long, low breaths. Ranger slept beside Ethan's cot. At 3:11 a.m., Ethan's eyes opened. For once, there had been no nightmare. He lay still, confused by the absence of it. Then Ranger raised his head. The dog looked toward the cabin. Nothing happened. After a minute, Ranger lowered his head again. Ethan remained awake until dawn. The next day passed quietly. He inspected the cabin exterior and found no obvious gas line, buried propane tank, or vent that might explain what had happened. He checked the fireplace flue. He examined the foundation as far as the soil allowed. Nothing. He spent the afternoon repairing the dock and replacing 2 rotten porch boards. Ranger behaved normally as long as he stayed outside. By sunset, Ethan had decided he would return to Clearwater Ridge the next morning and buy a carbon monoxide detector, mold test kit, and anything else that might give him an answer. The temperature dropped hard after dark. Frost formed on the porch railing. Ethan zipped himself into his sleeping bag and watched his breath drift through the lantern glow. $28,500, he murmured. Ranger's ears moved. And I'm sleeping outside. The dog's tail tapped once against the boards. Glad you're enjoying this. Sometime after midnight, the wind died. The change woke Ethan before any sound did. He checked his watch. 6 a.m. Beside him, Ranger was already standing, not looking at the cabin. North. His body had gone completely still, nose elevated, ears forward. Ethan sat up. What is it? Ranger took one step from the porch, stopped, sniffed again. This was different from his reaction to the cabin. There was no avoidance in him now. There was interest, specific and focused. Ethan pulled on his boots and jacket. He clipped a small flashlight to his coat and took a heavier one from his pack. Ranger moved into the clearing. Ethan followed. The forest swallowed the cabin within 30 yards. Old snow covered the shaded ground beneath the pines. Wet needles softened Ethan's footsteps. Granite pushed through the earth in dark ridges, forcing them to weave between boulders and exposed roots. Ranger stayed ahead, but never far. Every few yards, he stopped and tested the air. They moved north. Ethan remembered the county map, the place Ranger had touched with his paw. Coincidence, he told himself. Nothing more. The slope rose gradually. After roughly 200 yards, Ranger changed direction and moved toward a granite outcrop split by the roots of several old pines. Then he stopped. Ethan swept the flashlight across the ground. At first he saw nothing unusual. Then he noticed the snow. Everywhere around them, a thin white layer covered the forest floor. Except one place. Beneath a web of roots lay an oval patch of bare earth almost 6 feet long. Ethan crouched. He removed one glove and placed his palm against the soil. Warm, not hot, but unmistakably warmer than the frozen ground surrounding it. Ethan looked around. No spring was visible, no steam, no obvious reason. Ranger began digging. Chata, the dog stopped. Ethan examined the soil first. Dark, moist, mixed with pine needles. He found no fresh human footprints. Okay. Find it, Ranger dug. Earth flew between his rear legs as he worked beneath the roots. After less than a minute, his claws struck something, clink. Ranger stopped and looked at Ethan. Ethan knelt beside him and cleared the remaining soil with his hands. Metal appeared. He exposed several inches of a pipe roughly 6 inches across. Its exterior was heavily corroded. Orange rust layered over dark steel. It looked old enough to have been forgotten before Ethan joined the Navy, but the soil around it was warm. He leaned closer. Air touched his cheek. Ethan froze. He moved his bare hand toward the damaged seam. A faint current of warm air escaped from underground. That's not possible. Ranger sniffed the opening and immediately drew his head back. Ethan prevented him from approaching again. No, he put his glove back on. The pipe might have belonged to an old septic system or heating line, though neither explanation made much sense this far from the cabin. He pressed his palm against the steel. At first, there was only warmth. Then he felt it, a vibration so faint he almost dismissed it. He waited. There it was again, steady, continuous, mechanical. Ethan switched off his flashlight. Darkness closed around them. He listened. Wind moved somewhere above the ridge. Water touched rock far below, nothing else, but through his hand, the pipe continued to tremble. Something was running beneath Raven Rock. Ethan's pulse accelerated. The old impulse returned. Follow it. Find the entrance. Answer the question now. His flashlight moved toward the slope. Then he stopped himself. He remembered standing in a grocery store months earlier, convinced for one terrible second that the electronic chirp of a checkout scanner was something else entirely. The body could be certain and still be wrong. Evidence first. Ethan took out his phone. He photographed the pipe from several angles, then photographed the surrounding trees and granite so he could relocate it in daylight. He marked the coordinates. Then he covered most of the exposed metal again, leaving a small section visible. Come on. Ranger remained focused on the ground. We're done. The dog obeyed. Back at the cabin, Ethan didn't sleep. At first light, he loaded Ranger into the skiff and crossed Lake Blackwater. The morning had turned colder. Low clouds hid the upper mountains, and thin sheets of ice formed in the sheltered coves. Clearwater Ridge looked almost cheerful after 2 nights on the island. Pickup trucks moved along Main Street. Smoke rose from chimneys. The yellow sign over Miller's Dockside Diner glowed against the gray morning. Ethan went inside. Ranger settled beneath the booth facing the entrance. The waitress brought coffee. Ethan opened his phone and enlarged the photograph of the pipe. "That's Raven Rock." The voice came from behind him. Ethan turned. Frank Dawson stood beside the booth carrying a coffee mug. His eyes were on the screen. "You recognize it from a pipe?" "No." Frank pointed at the granite formation behind it. "That split ridge. I used to fish that side before the lake came up." Ethan studied him. "What is the pipe?" Frank didn't answer. He slid into the opposite side of the booth. "Where exactly did you find it?" "North End. Maybe 200 yards from the cabin." Frank's expression tightened. "Was it open, corroded seam, anything coming out, warm air?" Frank stopped moving. Ethan continued. "And it's vibrating." For several seconds, only the clatter of dishes from the kitchen filled the space between them. Frank set down his mug. "Show me again." Ethan handed him the phone. The older man enlarged the image. His thumb stopped over the exposed section. "I haven't seen one of these in 40 years. What is it?" Frank looked toward the diner windows. Beyond them, Lake Blackwater stretched beneath the cloudy sky. "When I was 19, this lake wasn't the size it is now." Ethan waited. Frank lowered his voice. "Before they expanded the dam, there were service roads running through valleys that are under 60 feet of water today. Mining roads, pump stations, ventilation lines." Ethan glanced at the photograph. "Mining." Frank nodded slowly. "Blackwater Consolidated. Still operating? Not for decades." Ethan looked down at Ranger. The dog was awake now, listening. "If it's abandoned," Ethan said, "why is that pipe warm?" Frank didn't answer. Instead, he asked, "You said it's vibrating, constantly." Frank leaned back. The color had drained slightly from his face. "That can't be right." "Why?" Frank looked directly at Ethan. "Because that line was supposed to be sealed before they filled the reservoir." The noise of the diner seemed to recede. Ethan thought of the warm patch in the frozen forest, the metallic taste inside the cabin. Ranger refusing to cross the threshold. Supposed to be? Frank stared toward the distant water. Raven Rock wasn't always an island. Ethan said nothing. Frank's eyes returned to the photograph, and whatever is moving air through that pipe now, it isn't supposed to exist. Ethan let the words settle. Outside Miller's Dockside Diner, morning traffic moved slowly along the lake road. A logging truck rolled past beneath a sky the color of wet steel. Beyond it, Lake Blackwater stretched toward Raven Rock, though the island itself was hidden behind low mist. "What was Blackwater Consolidated?" Ethan asked. Frank wrapped both hands around his coffee. "A mine. Copper mostly. Molybdenum later. Back then, half this town depended on it." "Where?" Frank pointed through the window toward the northern mountains. Main operation was 6 miles up Blackwater Creek, but tunnels went farther than people realized. Under Raven Rock, Frank looked at him. Raven Rock wasn't Raven Rock Island then. He pulled a paper napkin toward himself and drew a rough line across it. Before the dam expansion in the late 70s, the reservoir stopped about here. What you bought was a granite ridge connected to the eastern shore by a strip of land. Narrow, wooded, not good for farming. Mine company used it for service access. he added several lines beneath the ridge: drainage, ventilation, emergency access. Nobody paid much attention because it was company land. And then, mine started losing money. There were safety problems. Blackwater Consolidated shut down. Around the same time, the dam project raised the lake. Frank drew water over the old roads. Valleys disappeared. Roads disappeared. Some structures were demolished. Others were sealed and flooded. That ridge became an island. Ethan looked at the crude drawing. What happened to the tunnels? Officially? Frank gave a humorless smile. Closed. Ethan took his phone back. Officially isn't what I asked. Before Frank could answer, a woman's voice came from the counter. Are you talking about Raven Rock? Both men turned. A woman in a dark green jacket stood several stools away with a paper coffee cup in one hand. She looked to be in her mid-30s, with brown hair pulled back and the tired, practical expression of someone accustomed to being awake before sunrise. Frank shifted in his seat. Morning, Rachel. Her eyes moved to Ethan, then to Ranger beneath the table. You're the man who bought it. It wasn't a question. Ethan Cole, Rachel Bennett. She didn't offer her hand immediately. Instead, she looked at the photograph still visible on Ethan's phone. Where did you find that? North side of the island. Rachel's expression changed almost imperceptibly, Frank noticed. So you recognize it too? No. Her answer came too quickly. She turned toward the door. Frank called after her. Rachel, she stopped. Henry used to talk about those tunnels. At the mention of the name, something hardened in her face. My father talked about a lot of things before he died. Some of them might have been right. Rachel stared at Frank for a long moment. Then she looked at Ethan. Did you go inside the cabin? Yes. How long? About half an hour. Any symptoms? Ethan became still. Why? Headache. He didn't answer. Metallic taste? That got his attention. Frank slowly lowered his coffee. Rachel walked back to the booth. How bad? Not bad. It went away when I stepped outside. And the dog wouldn't enter. Rachel looked down. Ranger watched her calmly. Smart dog. What's happening on that island? Rachel pulled out the empty chair beside Frank. I don't know, but your father thought he did. She exhaled through her nose. My dad was Henry Bennett. Bennett Ranch used to run almost 900 acres south of the lake. Cattle, hay, some timber. Ethan waited. About 15 years ago, he started seeing things he couldn't explain. Calves born weak. Cows refusing water from two particular wells. A chemical smell after heavy rain. Did he test it? Constantly. What did he find? Depends which test you believe. Rachel's voice had acquired an edge. Private samples showed elevated metals and industrial compounds. Follow-up samples commissioned through the county came back within allowable ranges. Then Silver Ridge Minerals hired consultants who said there was no evidence their operation had anything to do with it. Frank looked down at the table. Rachel continued. People around town started treating Dad like he was looking for somebody to blame for a struggling ranch. What did Silver Ridge have nearby? Ethan asked. Mining operations north of the reservoir. Newer facilities. Different company name, different permits. Any connection to Blackwater Consolidated? I never proved one. Your father, he tried. The diner door opened. Cold air moved across the room. Rachel watched it close before continuing. He spent years writing agencies, county commissioners, environmental offices. The more he pushed, the more people stopped listening. What happened to the ranch? Her jaw tightened. Veterinary bills, bad seasons. Wells, we stopped trusting. Dad sold parcels to stay afloat. By the time he died, most of the original property was gone. Ethan heard the grief beneath the facts. Sorry. Rachel gave a small nod. I'm a veterinarian because of that ranch. Maybe because of him. I learned a long time ago that sick animals can't tell you which report to believe. Ranger rested his chin on Ethan's boot. Rachel noticed. Your dog knew something was wrong before you did. Looks that way. She studied Ethan for another moment. Come with me. 20 minutes later, they were driving along the southern edge of Lake Blackwater. Rachel led them to a weathered farmhouse above a broad valley of winter-brown pasture. Only 80 acres remained around the house. Beyond the fence stood newer properties and stretches of land planted with young timber. Inside a detached barn, Rachel unlocked a storage room. Boxes covered 2 long shelves. Henry Bennett had been written across several in black marker. My mother wanted me to throw these out, Rachel said. I couldn't. They carried 3 boxes to an old workbench. For the next hour, they went through maps, letters, water reports, photographs, newspaper clippings, and handwritten notes. Ethan did not understand all the chemistry. He understood patterns, dates, locations, repeated names. Rachel unfolded an engineering map so old, the paper had become soft along its creases. Lake Blackwater appeared smaller. The eastern shoreline extended into what was now open water. A ridge was marked with an old survey designation, Raven Rock Ventilation Access. Ethan leaned closer. A line ran beneath the ridge. It ended almost exactly where his cabin stood today. Rachel whispered, There it is. Ethan followed the line with one finger. Your father had this? He collected everything. Another document showed property transfers following the closure of Blackwater Consolidated. Company names changed. Blackwater Holdings, Northern Extraction Group, Cascade Industrial Properties, then another. Ethan recognized the last one, Silver Ridge Minerals. Rachel read it twice. That doesn't make sense. What? They don't own Raven Rock. I do. No. I mean, Dad checked their land holdings over and over. Ethan remembered Margaret's paperwork. The surface is mine. Rachel looked at him. What does that mean? There's a subsurface clause. They returned to the county office before closing. Margaret Ellis found the original deed chain. Laura Mitchell's name would not enter their lives until later. But even without an attorney, the language was clear enough to make Ethan uncomfortable. The surface estate had been sold. Limited subsurface mineral and access rights had not. Those rights had moved through successor corporations for decades. Current holder, Silver Ridge Minerals. Margaret removed her glasses. That doesn't give them the right to walk into your cabin. What does it give them? That's a lawyer question. Ethan looked through the window. Snow had started falling. Do they have any active permit beneath the island? Not that I can see. Rachel was silent during the drive back to her father's ranch. The mystery had changed. It was no longer an abandoned pipe. It had paperwork, ownership, history, and a company still operating within sight of Clearwater Ridge. Back in the barn, Rachel opened another box. The light outside faded from gray to blue, while Ethan searched Henry Bennett's notebooks. Most entries were ordinary ranch records, calving dates, feed costs, well depths. Then Rachel stopped turning pages. Wait. A loose sheet had been folded inside the back cover. Only half of it was filled. Henry's handwriting slanted downward as though he had written in a hurry. Rachel read silently, her face lost color. What? She handed Ethan the page. Several lines described water samples, pressure readings, and an old ventilation diagram. At the bottom was an unfinished sentence. Ethan read it once, then again. The island isn't the source, it's the vent. Rachel lowered herself onto a wooden chair. For years, her father had been remembered by many people in Clearwater Ridge as a stubborn rancher who couldn't accept bad luck. Now she stared at 6 words that suggested he had been looking in the wrong direction, only because everyone else had refused to look at all. Ethan unfolded the old map beside the note. The abandoned ventilation line beneath Raven Rock did not stop at the island. It joined a larger network. One branch disappeared beneath Lake Blackwater. Another ran north, toward land now controlled by Silver Ridge Minerals. Outside the barn, Ranger suddenly stood, his ears turned toward the darkening lake. Ethan followed his gaze. Across the water, Raven Rock was barely visible beneath the falling snow. The cabin was somewhere inside those trees. So was the warm pipe, and whatever had made Ethan sick. Rachel stepped beside him. If my father was right, Ethan finished the thought quietly, then whatever is under my island doesn't belong to the past. He looked toward the dark shape across Lake Blackwater, and Raven Rock may be the smallest part of it. Rachel did not answer. Snow drifted between them and the distant island, slowly erasing the opposite shore. Ethan had learned to distrust mysteries that grew faster than the evidence supporting them. Henry Bennett's note was disturbing. The old ventilation map was worse. Silver Ridge Minerals holding subsurface rights beneath Raven Rock made the coincidence difficult to ignore, but none of it proved what was happening now. By 8 the next morning, Ethan had a plan. Rachel met him at her veterinary clinic carrying 2 hard plastic cases, air monitors, she said. We use them around chemical storage and during certain building inspections. They're not laboratory equipment, but they'll tell us if the air changes. Ethan loaded them into the skiff. He had already bought a basic thermal camera, fresh batteries, protective gloves, and a respirator from an industrial supply store outside town. Rachel watched him arrange everything. You always this careful? No, what changed? Ethan glanced toward Ranger. Experience. The lake crossing took longer than usual. Snow had stopped, but wind pushed short gray waves across Blackwater. Ranger stayed low near the bow while Rachel held the gunwale with one hand and stared toward the mountains. When Raven Rock came into view, the cabin looked almost peaceful beneath its new covering of snow. That bothered Rachel more than she expected. This is the place people got sick, apparently, and you bought it anyway? Ethan throttled down. I didn't know that part. You knew somebody disappeared. I've made worse real estate decisions. Rachel looked at him. Ethan almost smiled. That was a joke, I wasn't sure. Neither was I. They landed at the repaired section of dock. Ranger jumped ashore and immediately began his familiar sweep of the clearing. Rachel watched him. He really won't go inside, you'll see. At the cabin, Ethan opened the door. Ranger, inside. The Malinois approached, stopped at the threshold. Rachel's expression changed. Again, Ethan shook his head. He heard me. Ranger sniffed the lower doorframe, then stepped backward. Rachel crouched several feet away. He's not acting frightened. No, he's avoiding something. That's what I think. They placed one monitor near the fireplace, another beside the bedroom, and a third close to the section of floor Ranger watched most often. Ethan used the thermal camera along the walls and foundation. Most of the cabin appeared exactly as expected for an unheated building. Cold walls, colder windows, slightly warmer sections where afternoon sun touched the cedar siding. Then he aimed the camera at the stone foundation. A faint band of warmth appeared beneath part of the floor. Rachel leaned over his shoulder. That shouldn't be there. No, they spent the rest of the afternoon outside. Every 30 minutes, Ethan checked the monitors. Nothing unusual. By sunset, Rachel seemed almost disappointed. Maybe temperature changes after dark. Maybe. You staying? Yes. Rachel looked toward the lake. I can stay too. Ethan shook his head. No reason for both of us. If those monitors start climbing, I leave. You don't investigate. I leave. She stared at him. That's not exactly convincing. Ethan pointed towards Ranger. He'll make sure. Rachel knelt beside the dog. Apparently somebody has to. She returned to Clearwater Ridge before darkness closed over the lake. Ethan prepared outside. He placed his sleeping gear beneath the porch roof and set an alarm to check the instruments every 45 minutes. For several hours, nothing changed. At 10:30, readings remained normal. At 11:15, still normal. At midnight, Ethan walked into the cabin wearing the respirator around his neck, but not yet over his face. One monitor had begun to move. Not much, but enough. He wrote down the number. At 12:18, it climbed again. Ranger stood outside the open door. Ethan looked at him. I see it. The dog remained rigid. By 12:31, 2 monitors were registering elevated volatile compounds. Ethan pulled the respirator into place. The room looked different now, though nothing visible had changed. The old chair, the fireplace, the warped floorboards, the lantern, all ordinary, yet something unseen was entering the cabin. Ethan followed the readings, highest concentration near the floor, near the stone foundation, exactly where Ranger had been staring. He removed a pry bar from his tool bag. 3 floorboards came up easily, the 4th resisted. Ethan worked it loose. Beneath the floor lay dark earth and stone. He aimed his flashlight down. There, a narrow masonry channel ran beneath the cabin foundation. It was older than the cabin itself. An old drainage route or ventilation passage. Ethan crouched lower. Mineral deposits covered a crack between 2 stones, forming a pale crust. Warm air touched his glove. He should have stopped. He knew that later. But evidence was inches away. He used the end of the pry bar to break a small section of the crust. It fractured with a dry snap. Air escaped. The odor arrived almost immediately. Chemical, sharp, metallic. Ethan jerked backward. The monitor alarm began chirping. He stood too quickly. The room tilted. His flashlight beam swept across the wall. He grabbed the table. Not again. His vision narrowed at the edges. His heart accelerated. For one confused moment, the cabin disappeared. Concrete dust, a dark corridor, someone shouting through a radio. Caleb Ethan squeezed his eyes shut. No. He knew this feeling, or thought he did. His chest tightened. The old shame came with it. You know better. Control it. The floor shifted beneath him. Then something struck the door. Ranger. The dog scratched hard against the wood. Ethan tried to move. His legs did not respond correctly. Stay. The word came automatically. Ranger ignored it. The door had not latched completely. The Malinois drove his shoulder against it. It opened. Ranger entered the cabin for the first time, not willingly, not because the danger was gone, because Ethan was still inside. The dog crossed the threshold low and fast. Ethan felt teeth close around the sleeve of his jacket. Ranger. The Malinois pulled. Ethan resisted instinctively. The room rolled sideways. His knee struck the floor. Ranger backed toward the doorway, dragging Ethan's arm. Then Ethan understood. This wasn't only panic. Something was physically wrong. Okay, Ranger pulled again. Ethan crawled 3 feet, 5. The doorway seemed impossibly far away. Cold air struck his face when they reached the porch. Ranger kept going. Down the steps, across the clearing. Ethan stumbled after him, fell to one knee, tried to rise and couldn't. The last thing he remembered was Ranger pressing against his side. When Ethan opened his eyes, snowflakes were landing on his face. Ranger lay across his chest. The dog's weight made breathing difficult, but Ethan did not push him away. For several seconds, he simply stared upward. Stars had appeared between the clouds. His head hurt, but the confusion was gone. Ranger lifted his head. "Hey!" The dog's tail struck the snow once. Ethan touched the scar beneath Ranger's eye. "You went inside." Ranger licked his chin. "Yeah, I noticed." Ethan remained outside until sunrise. He did not re-enter the cabin. Rachel arrived shortly after 7 and found him sitting beside a small fire, wrapped in a blanket. Her relief became anger the moment he told her what happened. "You said you'd leave." "I did. After you opened the channel, I needed a sample. You needed oxygen." Ethan held up a sealed collection vial. Rachel stared at it. "You got one?" Before things got interesting. She wanted to argue. Instead, she looked at Ranger. The dog was asleep beside Ethan's boots. "Did he pull you out?" "Most of the way." Rachel crouched and ran a hand gently along Ranger's neck. "Good boy." Ethan looked toward the cabin. "He crossed the door for me." Rachel understood what that meant. The dog that had refused the cabin since arriving had entered the place he considered dangerous because Ethan had not come out. 2 days later, preliminary laboratory results arrived. Rachel printed them at the clinic. Ethan stood beside her desk while Ranger slept near the radiator. "Industrial solvents," Rachel said. "What kind?" "Several compounds. Some can be associated with mining and mineral processing. Could they be left from Blackwater Consolidated?" Rachel continued reading. "Some contamination can remain for decades." Ethan waited. She did not look relieved. But Rachel turned the page toward him. "One of the compounds is associated with a formulation that wasn't commercially used here 40 years ago." "How recent?" "Recent enough that your abandoned mine explanation just got harder." Ethan stared at the report. The previous owners had not imagined the headaches. They had not invented the dizziness. The cabin had been making them sick. Maybe Robert Hale too. But the most disturbing part was no longer that something toxic had survived beneath Raven Rock. It was that something had apparently been introduced long after the mine was supposed to be dead. Ranger woke and raised his head. Ethan looked down at him. The dog had known before the monitors, before the laboratory, before Ethan. Rachel folded her arms. "If these results are right, somebody has been putting industrial material into that old system." Ethan looked through the clinic window toward Lake Blackwater. Across the water, invisible behind miles of winter haze, Raven Rock waited. The warm pipe was still breathing. The machinery was still vibrating. And now Ethan knew one thing for certain. Whatever lived beneath his island was not a ghost from 40 years ago. Someone was keeping it alive. Frank Dawson read the laboratory report without touching his coffee. They were back at Miller's Dockside Diner, in the same rear booth Ethan had begun using almost automatically. Morning sunlight flashed across Lake Blackwater beyond the windows, but the temperature had fallen overnight, leaving thin ice along the marina pilings. Rachel sat opposite Ethan. Ranger rested beneath the table with his scarred head across Ethan's boot. Frank reached the final page. "So Henry was right." Rachel looked down. "About something being wrong with the water, yes. We still don't know how much he understood." Frank folded the report carefully. "I owe your father an apology. You weren't the one calling him crazy. No. Frank stared through the window. I just didn't believe him. Rachel's expression softened slightly. Frank was quiet for so long that Ethan finally asked, "What aren't you telling us?" The old mechanic rubbed a thumb across the handle of his coffee mug. Robert Hale. The name changed the table. Ethan leaned back, the caretaker who disappeared. Frank nodded. January 1996. You knew him? Better than I let on. Outside, somebody started a diesel engine at the marina. Frank waited until the sound faded. Robert wasn't some drifter living alone because nobody wanted him. He was a maintenance man. Good with pumps, generators, anything mechanical. Raven Rock's owner hired him to fix the cabin and keep an eye on the property. What happened? Official version? Winter storm came through. Robert disappeared. Search teams assumed he went onto the ice or fell into the lake. You don't believe that? Frank shook his head. His skiff was tied to the dock. You mentioned that. I tied boats with Robert for 15 years. He used the same locking hitch every time. That boat hadn't broken loose and drifted back. Robert tied it himself. Rachel frowned. Maybe he walked onto the ice, without his coat. Silence. Frank continued. Search team found his winter coat hanging inside the cabin. Boots were gone, gloves too, but not the coat. Ethan pictured Raven Rock in January. Wind across open water, snow in the trees. A man leaving a cabin without his winter coat made little sense. Anything else? Frank's eyes met his. He'd been hearing pumps. Rachel stopped moving. For how long? Months. Frank looked ashamed now. He told me there was machinery running underneath the island after midnight. Said he could feel it through the floor. Ethan thought of the pipe vibrating beneath his palm. What did you tell him? That old mine tunnels settle. Water moves. Rock makes noise. Frank gave a bitter laugh. I had an answer for everything. Did he investigate? Robert investigated everything. Frank reached into his jacket and removed an old wallet. Behind his driver's license was a small photograph, faded almost white along the edges. Two younger men stood beside a rescue boat. Frank handed it across the table. That's Robert. Ethan studied the man in the photograph. Mid-30s. Lean, dark hair, broad smile. Nothing about him resembled a ghost story. He started taking pictures, Frank said. Pipes, equipment, boats coming near the north side after dark. What happened to the pictures? He said he mailed copies to the county. Margaret Ellis had shown Ethan the 1996 file. There had been no photographs. Those aren't in the records. I know. Did anyone investigate? Sheriff searched the island. Volunteers dragged sections of shoreline. Divers went in where conditions allowed. Frank's voice became quieter. I was search and rescue captain. Rachel looked at him. You searched for Robert. 3 days and found nothing? Nothing. Frank stared at his hands. The week before he disappeared, Robert called me. The diner seemed unusually quiet. He wanted me to come to Raven Rock. Said he'd found something and didn't want to be alone. Why didn't you go? Ethan asked, storm warning. Frank swallowed. I told him whatever it was could wait. Nobody spoke. Frank had apparently repeated that sentence to himself for 30 years. Ethan recognized the expression. Different memory. Same prison. Storm hit 2 nights later, Frank said. By the time we reached Raven Rock, Robert was gone. Rachel reached across the table and placed her hand briefly over Frank's. You couldn't know. Frank nodded without agreeing. Ethan understood that too. He looked out at the lake. For a moment, Raven Rock disappeared. Another place took its position. Concrete, dust, a radio screaming through static. Caleb Foster trapped beyond a collapsed section of wall. Ethan's shoulder had already been damaged. Blood ran down his sleeve. He remembered trying to move debris while the team leader shouted that a secondary detonation was expected. Withdrawal order, 30 seconds. Ethan had looked through the opening. Caleb had been alive. "Chief, go." Those were Caleb's last words to him. Ethan had obeyed. The second explosion came less than a minute later. "Ethan?" Rachel's voice pulled him back. Ranger was standing now, his shoulder pressed against Ethan's leg. Ethan put a hand on the dog's neck. "I'm okay." Rachel watched him. "You went somewhere." Ethan said nothing at first. Then, perhaps because Frank had just opened a door he had kept closed for decades, Ethan opened one too. His name was Caleb Foster. Frank looked up. "Teammate?" Ethan nodded. "Last operation." He kept his eyes on Ranger. Structure came down. Caleb was trapped. "We had intelligence that another blast was coming." His voice remained controlled. "I was ordered out." Rachel waited. "I left him." "You were ordered to withdraw." "I left him." Those aren't necessarily the same sentence. They've been the same sentence for me. Rachel did not tell him he was wrong. She did not tell him Caleb would have wanted him to live. She simply said, "Guilt doesn't always disappear when the facts disagree with it." Ethan looked at her. That was the first thing anyone had said about Caleb in years that didn't make him want to leave the room. Frank stared at his coffee. "That's why old men keep carrying storms around." Ethan almost smiled. 41 isn't old. Give it time. Under the table, Ranger settled again. For a few minutes, nobody talked about Raven Rock. That silence mattered. By afternoon, Ethan and Ranger were back on the island. He did not enter the cabin until Rachel could arrange better testing. The windows remained open, and a warning strip Ethan had tied across the doorway moved in the wind. They returned to the northern ridge. Ranger found the warm pipe immediately. Ethan photographed it again and followed the terrain downhill, looking for any visible continuation. Nothing. Then Ranger changed direction. He moved toward the western shoreline. "Ranger," the dog continued. Ethan followed through the pines. Near the water, Ranger began working the ground in a widening pattern, nose low. Then he stopped at a narrow cove protected by granite. Something looked wrong. Ice had formed along most of Raven Rock's shoreline. Here, a patch perhaps 30 feet wide remained open. Dark water moved gently against the rocks. Ethan crouched. Warm water. Ranger sniffed near the edge. Ethan pulled him back. No drinking, he watched the surface. Every few seconds, a faint disturbance appeared farther out. Not a wave, a pulse. Ethan returned to the skiff and retrieved a dry suit, mask, fins, safety line, and waterproof light. Combat diving had been part of another life, but the preparation came back without effort. Check seal, check air, check line, never assume. He secured one end of the tether to a pine above the cove. Ranger paced along the shoreline. "I'll be right there." The dog stared at him. Ethan entered the water. Cold pressed against the suit immediately. Visibility was poor. 5 feet, maybe 6. He moved along the rocky shelf beneath the island, following the unusual current. His light swept across granite. Old timber, a rusted cable, then something black appeared beneath a ledge. Ethan stopped. It was too smooth to be natural. He moved closer. A heavy industrial hose, perhaps 8 inches in diameter, emerged from beneath Raven Rock, not rusted, not abandoned. Modern synthetic material. Metal clamps secured it to the rock. Ethan touched the hose. It vibrated. The same steady mechanical rhythm he had felt through the buried ventilation pipe. His light followed it. The hose descended along the lake bed. 20 feet, 30, then disappeared into the darkness beyond the shelf. Away from Raven Rock, Ethan surfaced. Ranger stood chest deep at the shoreline, despite the freezing water, waiting. Back. The dog retreated only when Ethan climbed onto the rocks. Ethan removed his mask and looked across Lake Blackwater. The hose beneath him did not end at the island. It continued under the reservoir, toward the mainland, toward ranches, toward Clearwater Ridge. He thought about Henry Bennett's unfinished note. The island isn't the source, it's the vent. Ethan looked at Ranger. Robert Hale had heard pumps in 1996. Henry Bennett had spent years warning people about contaminated wells. Now a modern industrial line was running beneath the lake. 3 men had carried the same question across 3 different decades. Only one of them was still alive to answer it. Ethan looked toward the dark water where the hose had disappeared. He had bought Raven Rock because he wanted a place where the rest of the world could not reach him. Instead, beneath the frozen surface of Lake Blackwater, he had found something leading directly back to it. Ethan did not follow the hose that afternoon. The old version of him might have. The man he had been overseas would have treated an unknown line as a problem to solve immediately. But Lake Blackwater was not a battlefield, and Ethan had no team waiting behind him, so he went back to Clearwater Ridge. Frank spread 3 old engineering drawings across a workbench at the marina while Rachel photographed each one. "This one's from '78, Frank said, "right before they raised the reservoir." Ethan traced the original shoreline. The modern Raven Rock Island appeared on the map as a granite ridge connected to the mainland. Several narrow lines crossed beneath it. Ventilation. Frank nodded. "Drainage here. Service access here." One faded line ran beneath the western slope, then stopped at a square marked utility cistern. Ethan looked at Frank. "Still there?" "If they buried it properly, no. And if they didn't?" Frank shrugged. "Then you bought more than a cabin." The next morning, Ethan prepared differently. Rachel would remain on Raven Rock with Ranger while Ethan entered the water. Frank would monitor the marina radio. Ethan established a strict turnaround time. "If I'm not back at the surface in 20 minutes, he told Rachel, "you call Frank, and then you don't come after me." Rachel stared at him. "I mean it." So did Robert Hale when he thought he could handle things alone. Ethan paused. "This isn't that. Make sure it isn't." He checked his equipment one final time. Ranger stood at the shoreline watching. Ethan knelt beside him. "Stay with Rachel." The Malinois glanced toward her, then back at Ethan. "Stay." This time Ranger obeyed. Ethan entered the lake. Cold darkness closed over him. He found the black hose quickly and followed it beyond the rocky shelf. Visibility narrowed as the bottom dropped. 10 feet, 15, the hose descended beside the old ridge. His waterproof light illuminated pale sediment and submerged tree limbs left from before the reservoir expansion. Then the water began moving. At first, Ethan assumed it was a natural current. A few yards farther, the pull strengthened. His safety line tightened. Ethan stopped. Someone was drawing water toward a dark opening beneath the rock. Above him, Ranger suddenly began barking. Rachel had never heard him make that sound on the island. "Ranger?" The dog paced the shoreline, staring at the water. Then he turned toward her and barked again. Rachel grabbed the tether. It was pulling hard. "Ethan!" She tugged twice. The signal they had agreed meant return. Below the surface, Ethan felt it. Suction. Not strong enough to pull him instantly, but stronger with every foot toward the opening. He kicked backward. For several seconds, he barely moved. Then the line Rachel held went taut and gave him the extra leverage he needed. Ethan cleared the current and surfaced near the rocks. Rachel helped him out. Ranger pushed against him before Ethan had fully removed his mask. "I'm fine." Rachel was pale. "Your dog disagrees." Ethan looked toward the water. "There's an intake down there. Active? Has to be." Rachel glanced at Ranger. He knew. Ethan rubbed the dog's neck. "Yeah, again." The maps led them inland. By early afternoon, they reached the western slope where fallen pines lay across granite like giant matchsticks. Ranger worked ahead, while Ethan compared terrain with the 1978 drawing. The utility cistern should have been directly beneath them. Nothing was visible. Then Ranger disappeared behind a fallen trunk. Ethan heard scratching. They climbed over the timber. Beneath decades of needles and moss was a circular stone structure almost level with the ground. Frank had been right. The cistern still existed. Ethan cleared vegetation from the center. A steel access plate emerged. Old stone surrounded it. The plate itself was new, so was the electronic security panel mounted beside it. Rachel stared. That wasn't installed in 1978. No. Ethan photographed everything. He did not touch the lock. Instead, he installed 2 trail cameras high in nearby trees, carefully angled toward the access point. Then they waited. Night settled over Raven Rock. Rachel remained in the cabin clearing, safely outside the building, while Ethan watched the camera feed from the porch. At 11:47, Ranger stood. The cameras had not alerted. The dog stared toward the lake. "Something?" Ranger moved to the edge of the clearing. 30 seconds later, Ethan heard an engine, very low. A boat approached from the north without navigation lights. Ethan extinguished the lantern. They moved into the trees. The workboat landed on the far side of the island. 2 men stepped ashore. Both wore heavy Silver Ridge work jackets. One carried a hard equipment case. The other rolled 2 sealed drums onto a small handcart. Rachel's breathing changed beside Ethan. "Silver Ridge. I see them." They watched from cover. The men went directly to the hidden cistern. One entered a code. The modern steel plate opened. Warm light rose from underground. The men disappeared below. 40 minutes later, they returned without the drums. The access plate closed. The boat vanished across the lake. Only then did Ethan check the trail cameras, clear faces, Silver Ridge logos, timestamps, drums, access. Rachel stared at the images. "That's proof. Proof they're using the tunnel. Isn't that enough? Not yet." Ethan looked toward the hidden shaft. The following morning, after sending copies of the footage to Rachel's secure storage, Ethan prepared to descend. Respirator, protective clothing, gas monitor, helmet, camera, safety line. Rachel hated the plan. Ethan hated it too. That was partly why he trusted it. He was no longer chasing danger because danger made him feel useful. He was gathering evidence. The access panel had not fully latched after the workers' departure. Ethan opened the plate without damaging it. Warm industrial air rose from below. A metal ladder descended roughly 30 feet. Ranger approached the opening and stopped. Ethan looked at him. "Stay." Ranger remained beside Rachel. Ethan descended. At the bottom, his boots touched concrete. The tunnel was old, but almost nothing inside it was abandoned. Modern conduit ran along the walls. LED work lights illuminated new piping. A pump hummed behind a steel barrier. The air smelled faintly chemical even through the respirator. Ethan moved slowly. He photographed everything: tank labels, valve numbers, maintenance schedules, Silver Ridge identification tags. A staging area held sealed drums matching the ones delivered the previous night. Farther inside, a heavy line connected to an older mine gallery. Ethan followed it. The scale became clear. This was not one pipe dumping waste into a forgotten hole. It was a system. Old underground galleries had been repurposed as hidden storage and transfer chambers. Modern pumps moved chemical slurry through lines disappearing beneath the reservoir. Ethan photographed a clipboard hanging beside a control panel. False manifest copy, internal. He turned the page. Disposal volumes, dates, pressure readings. Then he found the map. It covered most of one wall. Hydrogeological monitoring, internal use only. Colored lines represented underground water movement. A broad red plume spread outward from the injection galleries, south, under Lake Blackwater, toward private property. Ethan stepped closer. He recognized names: Bennett, Harrison, Coleman, fields where cattle grazed, wells, a school district boundary. The contamination did not begin on Raven Rock. Henry Bennett had been right. The island was only a vent, a place where pressure and chemical vapor escaped from a much larger underground network. Ethan raised his camera. Then something on a nearby clipboard caught his eye. Pumping schedule. The most recent entry was yesterday. Below it, written in red, primary disposal cycle, 72 hours, estimated volume 680,000 gallons. Ethan stared at the number. This was no longer about proving why 4 owners had abandoned an island. Another major transfer was coming, and if the map was accurate, everything injected into those tunnels had somewhere to go. Groundwater, ranches, wells, the lake itself. A faint vibration traveled through the concrete beneath Ethan's boots. The pumps activated. He looked toward the old mine corridor. Deep inside the mountain, machinery began turning. Ethan took one final photograph. Then he climbed. When his head appeared above the shaft, Ranger was already there. The dog pressed his nose against Ethan's shoulder. Rachel helped him onto the snow. "What did you find?" Ethan removed the respirator. For several seconds he said nothing. He looked across Lake Blackwater. From Raven Rock, Clearwater Ridge seemed peaceful. Smoke above chimneys, white ranch fields, the wooden bridge crossing Blackwater Creek. A school bus moving along the distant road. People living ordinary lives above something they could not see. Ethan handed Rachel the camera. She scrolled through the photographs. Her face changed when she reached the contamination map. Then she saw her father's property. Nota. Ethan pointed to the final image. "Look at the date." Rachel enlarged it. 72 hours. Less now. Ranger sat between them, facing the forest. The machinery beneath Raven Rock continued to hum. For almost 30 years, the island had kept its secret, because everyone who came close enough to discover it had eventually left. Ethan Cole had spent 2 years believing survival meant walking away from everything. Now, for the first time since leaving the Navy, he understood with absolute clarity that there was something he could not walk away from. By sunrise, Rachel had called Laura Mitchell. Laura arrived in Clearwater Ridge before noon in a road-salted gray SUV, carrying 2 leather cases and the expression of a woman who had learned not to be impressed by dramatic claims. She was 44, an environmental attorney who had grown up 3 streets from Rachel before leaving northern Idaho for law school. She had spent the last 15 years working on groundwater disputes, industrial cleanup cases, and mineral rights litigation across the Northwest. Rachel met her at the veterinary clinic. Ethan stood near the back window with Ranger. Laura watched the trail camera footage first, then the photographs from beneath Raven Rock. She said almost nothing until Ethan showed her the wall-sized contamination map. Where are the originals? Camera card. Good. Copies are in 3 places. Better. Rachel leaned forward. Is this enough to stop the next pumping cycle? Maybe enough to get attention. That's not what I asked. Laura closed the laptop. Silver Ridge employs hundreds of people around Clearwater Ridge. They have lawyers, consultants, permits, environmental reports, and decades of relationships with county and state agencies. If we accuse them publicly before we can prove management authorization, they'll say Ethan entered an old industrial structure, photographed materials he doesn't understand, and drew conclusions from documents that could be outdated. The equipment is running, Ethan said. I believe you. The employees were carrying Silver Ridge drums. I saw them. Then what are we missing? The bridge between activity and responsibility. Laura pointed toward the screen. We need original records, disposal orders, internal data, something tying the operation to people who cannot dismiss it as a few employees acting outside company policy. Rachel stared at her. And if they pump 680,000 gallons before we get that? I didn't say wait. Laura's voice remained calm. I said build a case they cannot bury. That afternoon, Rachel began doing what her father had done years earlier. Only this time she was not alone. She pulled veterinary records from farms around the southern side of Lake Blackwater, cattle miscarriages, unexplained kidney problems, animals refusing certain wells, skin irritation, periods when entire herds were switched to trucked water. Laura obtained public groundwater reports and property transfer records. Frank searched old marina logs and newspaper archives. Ethan mapped locations. By evening, patterns began appearing. A ranch reporting well problems in 2012. A neighboring property reporting livestock illness in 2013. Another well abandoned in 2015. Then land sales. Rachel placed colored markers across a large map on her clinic wall. Red for water complaints, yellow for livestock problems, blue for property sales. By midnight, the colors overlapped. Rachel stepped back. No, Ethan looked at her. What? She pointed to a blue marker. That was Carter land. Another, McKinley. Another, part of ours. Laura checked the deeds. Several distressed properties had eventually been purchased by different companies. At first, the names appeared unrelated. Northwest Timber Holdings, Clearwater Agricultural Partners, Basin Development, LLC. Laura searched corporate registrations. Her expression hardened. They share representation. With Silver Ridge? Rachel asked. Affiliates. Not direct ownership in every case, but enough connections that I want the full filings. Rachel stared at the map. They poisoned people off their land. Laura immediately shook her head. We don't know that. Rachel turned. My father lost almost everything. I know. They knew. That is what we need to prove. Laura moved beside her. Don't make their case easier by claiming more than the evidence says. Ethan understood what Laura was doing. Anger wanted a clean villain. Truth was usually messier. By the next afternoon, the emerging picture was disturbing enough without exaggeration. Silver Ridge had not needed to deliberately contaminate ranches in order to steal them. The company had inherited or discovered an illegal disposal problem capable of costing hundreds of millions of dollars to remediate. Instead of reporting it, someone had kept the underground system operating. Contamination spread, property values fell, families struggled, and when some owners became desperate enough to sell, affiliated buyers were there. Rachel sat alone in the barn that evening, with one of Henry Bennett's notebooks open on her lap. Ethan found her there. Ranger walked ahead of him and rested beside her chair. Rachel touched the dog's head. My father died thinking everybody believed he was a fool. Ethan leaned against the workbench. He wasn't. He sold the north pasture first. She looked toward the dark window. That was where my mother was buried. Ethan said nothing. He kept telling me he'd buy it back. Her voice broke slightly. I told him to stop fighting. I told him maybe the tests were right. And he was seeing patterns because he needed somebody to blame. Ranger lifted his head. Rachel wiped her eyes. I was trying to save him from spending the rest of his life angry. You didn't know, neither did Frank. Ethan looked down. Doesn't stop the sentence from repeating. Rachel understood. Caleb, Robert, Henry. Different names. Same weight. The following morning, Ethan returned to Raven Rock. He had originally bought the island because 14 acres of water and pine seemed far enough away from every human problem. Now the quiet felt different. Across Lake Blackwater were families drinking from wells shown inside a red contamination plume. Children riding school buses, ranchers filling cattle troughs, people who had never heard of Raven Rock's tunnels. Ethan stood on the porch. If this place goes away, he told Ranger. It goes away. The dog watched him. I can live somewhere else. The words surprised him. A month earlier, Ethan had believed there was nowhere else. Ranger walked toward the cabin. He still stopped at the threshold. Then his nose shifted, not toward the floor, toward the porch. He moved to the far corner and began sniffing beneath 2 weathered boards. Ethan noticed immediately. What have you got? Ranger scratched once. Ethan knelt. The boards had been nailed down years earlier. One nail was newer than the others. He fetched a pry bar. The first board lifted. Nothing. The second revealed a shallow cavity between the porch joists. Inside lay a dark cylinder wrapped in cracked waxed cloth. Ethan carefully removed it. A film canister. Old. He carried it outside into better light. Inside were several strips of photographic negatives protected by paper sleeves. One sleeve bore handwriting. H. Robert Hale. Ethan called Rachel. By afternoon, they were examining the negatives using an old light table Frank found in marina storage. Most frames showed pipes, drums, equipment, license plates. A few were too damaged to interpret. Then Rachel reached the final strip. Stop. Ethan leaned closer. The photograph had been taken underground. A younger man stood beside a bank of pumping controls talking to 2 workers. His face was partly turned toward the camera. Rachel went still. No way. Frank adjusted the magnifier. Laura looked over his shoulder. The man was perhaps 30 years old in the photograph. Dark hair instead of silver, thinner face, but the features were unmistakable. Victor Langley. Today, Langley was the polished 58-year-old CEO of Silver Ridge Minerals. His name was on the hospital wing, the football field, the Veterans Memorial fundraiser. He appeared every December beside donated toys and every summer at the county fair. In Robert Hale's photograph from 1996, Victor Langley was standing beside the underground pumping controls beneath Raven Rock. Laura exhaled slowly. Now we have a bridge. Rachel stared at the image. My father was right, while Langley was telling everybody he wasn't. Ethan looked at the remaining negatives. We need copies of all of them. Frank turned toward the office. I've got a scanner. They had processed only 3 high-resolution images when Ranger stood. The dog had been lying beside the marina office door. Now his body was rigid, ears forward. Everyone stopped. A shadow crossed the frosted glass. 3 slow knocks followed. Frank looked toward Ethan. The marina was closed. No customers were expected. Ranger moved in front of Ethan without being told. Another knock. Polite, measured. Ethan stepped toward the door. Through the narrow window, he saw an expensive black winter coat. Behind the man stood another figure, broad shoulders, military posture, and beyond them, tied to Frank's dock, was a sleek enclosed boat Ethan had never seen before. He opened the door halfway. The older man outside smiled, silver hair, tailored coat, calm eyes. Ethan recognized him immediately from the photograph lying on the light table 20 feet behind him. Victor Langley looked past Ethan toward Ranger, then back at Ethan. "Chief Cole," he said pleasantly, "I think it's time we talked about your island." Victor Langley spoke as though they had arranged the meeting. Behind him stood Mason Pike. Ethan did not know the man's name yet, but he recognized the type immediately. 40-something. Heavy winter coat that did not hide an athletic frame. Eyes that checked windows, hands, exits, and distances before settling on Ethan. Not a lawyer, not an accountant. Ranger recognized something too. A low vibration formed in the dog's chest. Ethan said. Langley's smile remained. "Beautiful animal. What do you want?" "5 minutes. You've had 30 seconds. Frank appeared behind Ethan. "This marina is closed." Langley glanced past him. Frank Dawson. Been a long time. Not long enough. That changed Langley's expression for less than a second. Then the smile returned. "I'd prefer not to conduct business in the doorway." Ethan stepped outside instead. Ranger came with him. Mason shifted slightly as the dog emerged. There it was. Recognition, not fear, professional caution. Ethan filed that away. Wind moved across the marina, pushing small waves against the pilings. Langley's enclosed boat rocked gently at the dock. "Walk," Ethan said. They moved toward the end of the pier. Mason followed several yards behind. "You purchased Raven Rock recently," Langley began. "You already know that. I make it my business to understand property affecting Silver Ridge operations. My cabin affects your mining company, potentially. The deed is complicated. Surface isn't." Langley nodded, "Which is why I'm here." He removed an envelope from inside his coat. "Our company would like to purchase Raven Rock." Ethan did not take it. "Wasn't for sale. Everything is for sale under the right circumstances. Then you bought the wrong island." Langley seemed amused. $28,500. Ethan's eyes narrowed. "That's what you paid. County records are public." Langley extended the envelope. "We're offering $750,000. Even Frank, standing 20 feet away, heard the number. Ethan looked toward Raven Rock. It was barely visible across the water. "You want to pay me more than 20 times what I paid. Silver Ridge has long-term environmental monitoring interests beneath that portion of the reservoir. Consolidating access simplifies operations. Environmental monitoring." Yes, Ethan finally took the envelope. He opened it. The offer was real. $750,000, no financing. Fast closing, confidentiality clause. He handed it back. "No." Langley's smile weakened. "You haven't considered it." "I just did." "Ethan," it was the first time Langley used his first name. "You've served your country. You've been through enough. $750,000 gives you choices. I already made one." Langley studied him. Then he looked toward Ranger. $1 million. Ethan said nothing. 1.4. Frank shifted behind them. Mason remained perfectly still. Langley continued. "Cash purchase. We cover taxes, legal fees, relocation. You walk away with enough money to live anywhere you want." Ethan looked at the man standing before him. Victor Langley had spent decades becoming the face of Clearwater Ridge's prosperity. His company employed fathers and daughters, sponsored Little League, paid for a new emergency room. Every detail of his appearance communicated reason, control, respectability. Ethan thought of the photograph, 30 years younger, standing beside hidden pumping controls. Why? Langley's eyes hardened slightly. Excuse me? Why is an island nobody could sell for 37 years suddenly worth $1.4 million? Strategic value changes, 2 days after I start asking about tunnels. Mason's attention sharpened. Langley looked toward the mountains. You've been talking to people. I live in America. It happens. Rachel Bennett? Ethan said nothing. Her father spent years trying to blame Silver Ridge for every problem on his ranch. Henry Bennett isn't the one I'm talking to. No, he's dead. The sentence was delivered without cruelty. That somehow made Ethan dislike it more. Langley stepped closer. I know men like you, Chief. No, you don't. I know what happens when people who've lived under extraordinary stress begin looking for patterns. Ethan's jaw tightened. You should take the money. No. Langley exhaled. For the first time, the polished businessman disappeared. Only slightly, but enough. You spent enough years underground, Chief Cole. Ethan stopped breathing. Langley continued. Don't make Raven Rock another place you can't get out of. The marina vanished, not completely, just enough. Wood beneath Ethan's boots became broken concrete. Cold wind became dust. The lake became a dark corridor. Caleb's voice came through a radio that had not existed for years. Chief, go. Ethan's chest tightened. Sound narrowed. His injured shoulder seemed suddenly trapped beneath weight. He knew what was happening. Knowing did not stop it. Then Ranger touched him, not dramatically. One firm contact against Ethan's left leg. The dog remained there. Ethan looked down. Scar beneath the right eye, brown eyes, gray around the muzzle. Here, now, Lake Blackwater, Clearwater Ridge, Ranger. Ethan drew one breath, then another. The marina returned. He looked at Langley. How do you know about that? Langley said nothing. Ethan stepped forward. Mason immediately moved. Ranger moved faster. The Malinois placed himself between the two men. No bark, no lunge, just position. Mason stopped. Ethan looked at him. Former military, private sector. That explains the posture. Mason's eyes stayed on Ranger. Langley adjusted his coat. The offer remains open until tomorrow evening. It isn't open now. Think carefully. I did. Langley walked back toward the boat. Mason followed. Before boarding, he looked at Ethan. There was no arrogance in his expression, something closer to assessment. He understood exactly what Ethan had been trained to do. The enclosed boat pulled away from the marina. Frank waited until it disappeared. That went well. Ethan looked toward Ranger. His breathing had normalized. Could have gone worse. Rachel and Laura came outside. Laura's face was pale. He knows. Yes. The evidence? Not necessarily. Rachel looked at Ethan. What did he mean about underground? Ethan didn't answer. Laura did. He researched Ethan. Why? Because people don't offer $1.4 million without knowing who they're buying from. Ranger suddenly turned toward the office. His nose lifted. Then he moved to the place where Langley had stood near the doorway. He sniffed the boards, followed the scent inside, past the desk, toward the rear workroom. Ethan followed. Ranger stopped beside the table where Robert Hale's film canister rested. Rachel stared. His scent. Ethan crouched. Ranger sniffed the canister, then the floor, then looked toward the door Langley had used. Frank whispered, "He knows Robert left something." That changed everything. Until then, Ethan had assumed Langley wanted Raven Rock because Ethan had discovered the active tunnels. Now there was another possibility. Langley had been worried about the island long before Ethan arrived. Maybe for 30 years, Laura began organizing evidence immediately, everything duplicated. Separate locations. They worked until darkness. Trail camera footage, tunnel photographs, laboratory results, Henry Bennett's records, property maps. 3 of Robert Hale's negatives had already been scanned at full resolution. The rest had not. Frank's old scanner was painfully slow, and the high-resolution files were enormous. Ethan tried uploading them through the Marina connection. It failed twice. Laura copied what they had onto encrypted drives. "I'll take these." "What about the originals?" Rachel asked. Ethan looked at the film canister. "With me." Laura stared at him. "That's a terrible idea, which is why nobody will expect it. I wouldn't count on that." A weather alert sounded on Frank's radio. Winter storm warning, heavy snowfall, high winds, rapidly falling temperatures, lake travel potentially dangerous after midnight. Frank looked outside. Clouds were already swallowing the Selkirks. Storms moving faster. Rachel turned to Ethan. "You're not going back tonight." "Yes, I am." "No. If Langley knows Robert hid something, Raven Rock is the first place he'll search. Then let him search an empty island and find whatever we haven't found yet." Laura stepped between them. "Don't play soldier." Ethan's expression hardened. "I'm not that good. Because this isn't a mission. No." He looked toward Ranger. "It's my property." Laura understood the difference. He wasn't returning to hunt anyone. He was going to preserve evidence. Ethan sealed Robert's original negatives, copies of the underground pumping records, and a data drive inside a waterproof pouch. He sent Laura every duplicate the weak connection would accept. The remaining high-resolution scans refused to transfer. At 7:40 p.m., Ethan and Ranger left the marina. The lake was already rough. Snow moved sideways through the beam of the skiff's light. Rachel stood at the dock until they disappeared. Raven Rock emerged from darkness 40 minutes later. Ethan secured the boat. Ranger jumped ashore. For several minutes, nothing happened. Then the Malinois stopped. His nose lowered to the snow near the cabin porch. He followed a scent. Not Ethan's, not Rachel's, not Frank's. Ranger moved toward the northern forest. Ethan's hand tightened around the waterproof evidence pouch. Across Lake Blackwater, the lights of Clearwater Ridge were disappearing behind the storm. He looked at his watch. Langley's deadline expired tomorrow evening. But Ethan no longer believed Victor Langley intended to wait that long. Somewhere beneath Raven Rock, pumps continued moving through tunnels that should have died 40 years earlier, and somewhere across the darkening lake, a man who had spent 30 years protecting that secret now knew the island had finally found an owner who would not leave. Snow erased Ethan's footprints almost as quickly as he made them. Ranger stopped at the tree line. His body went rigid. Ethan listened. At first, he heard only wind. Then, far out on Lake Blackwater, an engine started. No navigation lights appeared, and it was coming toward Raven Rock. Ethan stood motionless beneath the pines. The engine vanished beneath the wind. For a moment, he wondered whether the storm had carried the sound from somewhere farther up the lake. Ranger answered the question. The Malinois turned toward the northern shore, ears forward, body rigid. Someone was coming. Ethan returned to the cabin clearing without using his flashlight. The portable generator was running beside the shed, powering 2 exterior work lamps and the battery charger. Then it coughed. Once, twice. Silence. Darkness swallowed the clearing. Ethan moved toward it. The fuel tank was half full. He crouched and ran his fingers beneath the engine. Wet. He smelled gasoline. The fuel line had been sliced, not cracked, cut. Ethan looked toward the cabin. A weak light still glowed through one window from the backup battery. It flickered, then disappeared. He checked the exterior cable. Cut 2. Anger appeared beside him. Okay. Ethan's voice was almost lost in the storm. They're here. He did not go looking for them. That distinction mattered. He moved the waterproof evidence pouch beneath his jacket, checked his radio, and retreated toward terrain he already knew. Raven Rock had become familiar during the previous days. Narrow trail between two granite walls, fallen pine above the western slope. Old maintenance gate, steep drop near the northern ridge. He had no intention of fighting anyone if he could avoid it. His objective was simple. Stay alive. Keep the evidence. Get off the island when weather allowed. Ranger froze. Through the snow came the soft scrape of aluminum against rock. Boat landing, then voices, 3 men. Ethan could not make out the words. A white beam moved briefly through the trees. Then another. He and Ranger backed deeper into the forest. Ethan placed 2 simple noise alarms across the narrow trail using empty metal cans and cord from his repair supplies. Nothing designed to hurt anyone, only to tell him where they were. Minutes later, metal rattled behind him. One of the alarms, a voice cursed. Another voice answered. Ethan recognized it. Mason Pike. Cabin first. They were not hiding their presence anymore. From behind a granite shelf, Ethan saw 3 figures cross the clearing. Mason led. The other 2 wore dark winter gear and carried long cases along with heavy packs. One opened the cabin door. The second went to the porch. Nothing here. Search it. Mason's flashlight moved across the floorboards. Find the film. Ethan's suspicion became certainty. They knew about Robert Hale. Ranger looked up at him. Ethan placed 2 fingers against the dog's shoulder. Stay. A contractor emerged carrying Ethan's bedding. He's been outside, then he's close. Mason looked into the forest. Demolition team starts below. We collapse the transfer chamber, destroy the old access, and we're gone before daylight. What about coal? Mason's answer came without emotion. Storm like this? Man with his history goes out alone, gets turned around, falls through ice. Tragic. Ethan felt anger rise, not because of himself, because the sentence sounded practiced. A story prepared before the event. Maybe Robert Hale had been given one too. The men moved north. Ethan waited. Then he and Ranger circled toward the old cistern. The contractors had left the access plate open. Light glowed from below. Ethan heard equipment being carried down. He could retreat to the shoreline, try the radio, wait for help. Then a different sound reached him. A power drill. They were destroying evidence. Ethan touched the pouch beneath his jacket. Robert's negatives were safe, but the original pumping records and underground equipment could prove far more. He made a decision not to attack, to preserve what he could. Ethan descended through the secondary maintenance route he had mapped earlier. Ranger followed. Inside, the tunnels echoed with machinery and distant movement. Ethan reached the control corridor, or before the contractors. He removed the internal pumping log from its protective case, photographed the latest entries, and transferred a data archive from an unlocked maintenance terminal onto the drive in his evidence pouch. A light appeared around the corner. Ethan killed his flashlight. Ranger flattened beside him. Footsteps approached. Ethan waited until the contractor passed the junction. Then he closed and locked a maintenance gate between them. The man spun. Hey! Ethan was already moving. No confrontation, no unnecessary risk, just distance. An alarm began sounding deeper in the mine. Mason shouted, "He's down here!" Ethan and Ranger moved through the older gallery. The air monitor clipped to Ethan's jacket began chirping. He pulled on his respirator. A sudden explosion cracked through the tunnel, not large, a demolition charge. But inside the confined space, the pressure wave struck Ethan like a physical blow. His flashlight hit the wall. For one instant, Raven Rock vanished. Concrete dust, heat, Caleb screaming through radio static, the collapsed corridor. Ethan stopped. He could not move. His mind knew Idaho. His body knew somewhere else. "Chief, go." Caleb's voice. No, not Caleb, memory. Ethan pressed one hand against the wall. Another charge detonated. His breathing accelerated. Ranger had been moving toward Mason's position. The dog stopped, turned, came back. Ethan, no human had spoken his name. Ranger pressed his body against Ethan's legs. Ethan looked down. Pale scar, brown eyes, gray muzzle, Ranger. The dog remained against him. Ethan forced himself to identify what was real. Cold concrete respirator. Red emergency light. Ranger, Raven Rock. He inhaled, exhaled, then the ceiling 20 feet ahead collapsed. Rock and timber crashed across the exact route Ethan would have entered if Ranger had continued pursuing the men. Dust rolled through the tunnel. Ethan stared at the blocked passage. Ranger had saved him again. Good call. The dog sneezed dust from his nose. Ethan turned toward the old drainage route. They needed out. Now. Behind them, Mason shouted something Ethan couldn't hear. A third charge detonated. This one was wrong. Too close. Too early. A deep cracking sound traveled through the mountain. Mason's voice changed. "Move! Move!" Water burst from a fractured pipe. The stream became a torrent within seconds. Ethan ran. Ranger stayed beside him. The old tunnel shook. Timbers groaned overhead. Ethan reached a junction and saw the vertical escape shaft ahead. 30 yards. Then the ceiling came down. A timber struck Ethan across his injured shoulder and drove him to the floor. Pain flashed white through his vision. He tried to rise. Couldn't. Water rushed around his knees. Ranger circled him frantically. "I'm okay." He wasn't. Ethan pushed against the timber. It moved less than an inch. Another collapse sounded behind them. The tunnel was failing section by section. Ranger grabbed Ethan's sleeve. Not this time. The dog pulled. Ethan looked toward the escape shaft. Too far. He looked at the waterproof pouch beneath his jacket. Then at Ranger. "Come here." The Malinois approached. Ethan removed the pouch and secured it tightly against his chest again. If rescuers found him, they would find the evidence. But Ranger had another chance. Ethan pointed toward the exit. "Ranger, out." The dog did not move. "Out." Ranger looked toward the shaft, then back at Ethan. Water climbed higher. Ethan's voice broke through the tunnel. "Ranger, out!" the command echoed. For one terrible second, the dog remained beside him. Then training overcame everything else. Ranger turned. He ran. His injured rear leg slipped once on the wet concrete. He recovered, reached the narrow opening, looked back. Ethan saw his silhouette against the faint light. Go. Ranger disappeared. Ethan closed his eyes. Good boy, the mountain answered with a roar. Stone collapsed between them. The light vanished. Silence followed. not true silence. Water still moved somewhere in the dark. Rock settled. Ethan could hear his own breathing, but Ranger was gone. For the first time since his final deployment, Ethan Cole was completely alone underground. He tried the radio. Static. He tried pushing the timber again. Nothing. His shoulder burned. Cold water continued rising around him. Then Ethan remembered Caleb, trapped, waiting. A terrible thought entered his mind. Maybe this was what Caleb had felt after Ethan obeyed the order and left. Ethan lowered his head. No. The word disappeared into the darkness. He had spent years punishing himself for surviving one collapse. He would not use another one to finish the sentence. He searched the wall with his free hand. Concrete, pipe, steel, then an opening. A narrow service passage, barely wide enough. Ethan twisted beneath the timber. Pain tore through his shoulder, but something shifted. Enough. He pulled himself sideways. The beam released him. Ethan crawled. Behind him, water filled the corridor. Ahead was only darkness. On the surface, Ranger burst from the northern forest into the storm. His coat was covered in gray dust. Blood marked one front paw where Rock had cut it. He reached the cabin clearing, stopped, turned back toward the trees. Ethan had ordered him out. Ranger had obeyed. But the Malinois did not leave Raven Rock. He stood alone in the snow, staring toward the collapsed mountain. Then, somewhere far across Lake Blackwater, another engine fought its way through the storm. Ranger turned toward the sound. A pair of white lights appeared between curtains of snow. They vanished behind waves, returned. The boat was moving slowly, fighting wind that had transformed Lake Blackwater into a field of black water and white spray. Ranger limped toward the shore. Minutes later, the rescue boat struck Raven Rock's damaged dock. Frank Dawson was at the controls. Rachel jumped out before he had secured the line. Behind her came Laura Mitchell and 2 county rescue deputies carrying medical packs, ropes, portable lights, and cold weather gear. Ethan! Rachel's voice disappeared into the storm. No answer. Then she saw Ranger. The dog stood 20 yards away. Gray mine dust covered his face and shoulders. Blood darkened the snow beneath one front paw. Rachel stopped. Oh, God! Ranger looked behind her, then toward the forest. Where is he? The Malinois turned and limped north. Frank grabbed a searchlight. Follow the dog. They found the cistern entrance partly collapsed. Fresh rock covered the slope. Steam and dust escaped through gaps in the debris. One deputy crouched. Anybody down there? Nothing. Rachel looked at Ranger. The dog was breathing hard. You came out alone. She did not finish the thought. Ranger suddenly moved toward a narrow opening beside the collapsed entrance. Ranger! He disappeared inside. Rachel started after him. The deputy caught her arm. You won't fit. He's going back. Let him. The words sounded wrong, but Frank understood. He's looking for Ethan. Inside the damaged tunnel, Ranger moved through darkness. The passage was barely wide enough for his shoulders. Dust coated his nose. His injured paw left small marks on the concrete. Ahead, water moved through a drainage channel. Something floated against the edge. A black waterproof pouch. During the collapse, the strap had torn loose from Ethan's damaged jacket while he crawled into the service passage. The pouch had been carried several yards by the water. Ranger stopped, sniffed. Ethan. He took the pouch gently in his mouth, then backed through the opening. Rachel saw him emerge. What's that? Ranger carried the pouch directly to her. Laura recognized it. The evidence. Rachel took it. The seal remained intact. For 1 second, relief crossed Laura's face. Then she looked at the tunnel. "Where's Ethan?" Ranger turned back. He could have stayed. He had completed the command Ethan gave him. He had brought out the evidence. Instead, Ranger limped away from the cistern, not toward the cabin. West. "He's going somewhere," Frank said. They followed. Ranger crossed the ridge through knee-deep snow. Twice he slipped because of his injured paw. Twice he rose before Rachel could reach him. "Easy, boy," he ignored her. At the western slope, Ranger stopped beside a granite face almost completely buried beneath snow. He dug. Rachel looked at Frank. "What's there? I don't know." Ranger ran 10 yards toward them, then returned to the rock. Dug again. Came back. "He's showing us something," Laura said. Frank swept his light across the granite. Then his expression changed. "Wait." He dropped his pack and pulled out one of the old engineering drawings they had brought from the marina. His gloved finger traced the western edge of Raven Rock. Emergency ventilation. Rachel leaned closer. "The one that was sealed, supposedly." Frank looked toward the dog. "Robert showed me this drawing 30 years ago. The rescue deputies began clearing snow." Ranger dug beside them until Rachel pulled him back to protect his injured paw. Beneath 2 feet of snow, they found loose rock. Behind it, cold air moved through a narrow gap. One deputy removed a stone, then another. Airflow. Frank dropped to his knees. "Ethan!" Nothing. They listened. Wind screamed through the pines. Rachel closed her eyes, then clang. Everyone froze. A second sound. Clang. Several seconds passed. Clang. 3 impacts against metal. Rachel covered her mouth. "He's alive." Far inside Raven Rock, Ethan rested against the wall of a narrow service chamber. His flashlight had died. The radio still produced only static. He had found an old metal pipe and struck it with a loose piece of rock whenever he thought he heard movement outside. His shoulder was nearly useless. His clothes were wet below the waist. The chamber had protected him from the flooding, but cold was working into him slowly. He understood what came next. Confusion, fatigue, sleep. He had seen hypothermia before. He struck the pipe again. Nothing answered. Ethan lowered the rock. In the darkness, he thought about Ranger. He had sent him away. That had been the right decision. It still hurt. "Stay out," Ethan whispered. Above him, drilling began. The rescue team could not simply tear open the old shaft. Loose granite covered a passage that might collapse if they moved the wrong section. So they worked slowly, painfully slowly. Frank identified the original shaft angle from the drawing. The deputies stabilized the opening. Laura held lights. Rachel stayed beside Ranger. The dog had stopped pacing. For the first time since Ethan bought Raven Rock, Ranger whined. One quiet sound. Rachel put both hands around his face. "We're getting him." Ranger stared at the rock. Hours seemed to pass inside minutes. Snow accumulated on shoulders. Gloves soaked through. The rescue boat pulled against its lines below. Finally, one deputy shouted, "I've got a void!" They widened the opening. A beam of light entered the old ventilation passage. "Mr. Cole," a faint voice answered. "Here." Rachel's knees nearly gave way. The passage was too narrow for a full rescue team, but one deputy crawled through with a medical bag and rope. 10 minutes later, he called back. "Found him. Conscious. Hypothermic. Shoulder injury." They rigged a careful extraction. No cheers. Not yet. Only instructions. Pull, stop, adjust, again. Ranger stood despite Rachel trying to keep him down. Then a gloved hand appeared from the opening, an arm, a shoulder. Ethan. His face was gray with cold and dust. His eyes were half closed. Rachel moved forward. Ethan, he barely responded. Then Ranger limped into the light. Ethan's eyes opened, his hand lifted. Ranger tried to stand taller, but his injured paw folded beneath him. Ethan reached farther. The Malinois placed his head beneath Ethan's palm. "You were supposed to leave." Ranger closed his eyes. For the first time that night, Ethan smiled. Barely, but it was there. They wrapped him in thermal blankets and carried him toward the shoreline. Rachel walked beside the stretcher. Ranger refused to ride until Ethan touched the side of the rescue sled. Up only then did the dog climb beside him. As the boat crossed toward Clearwater Ridge, dawn began turning the eastern sky pale. Raven Rock receded into snow and mist. Laura sat near the stern with the waterproof pouch on her lap. She opened it carefully. The negatives were there. Pumping records, data drive, everything Ethan had risked bringing out. Then something slipped from Robert Hale's old film envelope. It landed against the aluminum deck, a tiny brass key. Laura picked it up. A paper tag had been tied through the hole. Numbers were written on it in faded ink. Frank looked over from the controls. His face changed. "I know that numbering system." "What is it?" Rachel asked. "Old Clearwater Savings, the bank?" Frank nodded before it merged. Laura turned the tag beneath the cabin light. "Safety deposit box, looks like it." Rachel stared at the key. Robert Hale had hidden photographs beneath the porch, but apparently he had not trusted Raven Rock with everything. By 9 that morning, Ethan was in a small hospital room overlooking Lake Blackwater. His shoulder was immobilized. Warm fluids ran through an IV. Ranger lay beside the bed with his paw bandaged. Rachel sat near the window. Frank stood with Laura in the hallway. Nobody had slept. Laura held the brass key. For 30 years, everyone asked where Robert Hale went. Ethan looked toward her. She closed her hand around the key. "I think we've been asking the wrong question." "What question should we ask?" Laura looked across the lake toward Raven Rock. "What did Robert make sure survived him?" Ethan's hand settled on Ranger's head. Outside, morning light reached the Selkirks, for the first time since the island had entered Ethan's life. The machinery beneath Raven Rock had gone silent. But the truth had not. It was waiting inside a box that nobody had opened in 30 years. Clearwater Savings no longer existed under that name. The old brick bank on Main Street had become a branch of a regional company years earlier, but the original vault remained beneath the building. Laura spent most of the morning working through records, while Ethan stayed at the hospital under observation. By afternoon, she had an answer. Box 417, registered to Robert Hale in December 1995. Never surrendered, never claimed. The bank opened it the following morning under the supervision of law enforcement. Inside were 3 objects: a weathered journal, a bundle of photocopied company documents, and a small cassette tape labeled in Robert's handwriting. "If something happens to me." The recording was difficult to hear at first. Static, a chair moving. Then Robert Hale's voice came through, tired, real. He described pumps operating beneath Raven Rock after midnight. He named supervisors, listed dates, recorded truck numbers and chemical shipments. Then he said the name everyone in the room had been waiting for: Victor Langley. In 1996, Langley had been a junior operations manager for the company that later became part of Silver Ridge Minerals. Robert had photographed him underground. The documents explained why. Pressure warnings had appeared inside the old mine galleries. Chemical vapor was escaping through ventilation channels beneath Raven Rock. Monitoring wells farther south were beginning to show changes. The underground disposal system should have been shut down. Instead, Robert wrote, Langley authorized continued pumping, while management searched for a way to conceal the problem. Rachel listened without moving. Her father's warnings had begun only a few years later. Laura turned another page. There's more. Internal correspondence described complaints from Raven Rock: headaches, dizziness, metallic taste, equipment behaving strangely because corrosive vapor was damaging electrical connections. One memo contained a sentence that made the room silent. Permanent occupancy of Raven Rock should be discouraged. Ethan looked toward Ranger. The dog lay beneath the conference table, his bandaged paw stretched forward. The answer had been written down 30 years ago. The island was never cursed. It had been kept empty. Robert's final journal entries described what happened next. He confronted workers underground during a winter pumping cycle. An argument followed. Robert tried to leave through an old service passage. Part of the tunnel failed. He was injured, but he did not die immediately. That truth was worse. Company security found him alive. Internal notes in the safety deposit box showed management discussed calling county rescue services. They decided against it. Any public rescue operation would bring firefighters, deputies, inspectors, and reporters directly into the illegal disposal network, so they sealed access to the damaged section. Robert Hale was left inside. Authorities were allowed to believe he had disappeared into Lake Blackwater. Frank sat down when Laura read that part. For nearly 30 years, he had imagined Robert alone beneath winter ice. The truth was that Robert had been beneath the island, waiting for help that men had deliberately chosen not to call. Frank covered his face. I should have gone when he called. Ethan looked at him. No. Frank lowered his hands. Ethan's voice was quiet. You didn't put him there. For a long moment, neither man spoke. Then Frank nodded. Something Ethan had been unable to say about Caleb for years had finally become possible when he said it to someone else. Sometimes leaving was not abandonment. Sometimes surviving an order was not betrayal. And sometimes the guilt belonged exactly where the evidence placed it. The investigation moved quickly after that. State environmental authorities secured Raven Rock. Federal investigators entered the underground network with hazardous material teams. The recovered data drive matched Robert's records with modern pumping logs. The trail camera footage established recent access. Laboratory samples established modern contamination. Corporate records connected authorization to senior Silver Ridge management. Mason Pike and the contractors were identified through marina cameras and evidence recovered after the tunnel attack. Victor Langley was arrested before the week ended. The charges that followed were not simple or theatrical: hazardous waste violations, conspiracy, obstruction, falsification of environmental records, evidence destruction, and criminal liability connected to Robert Hale's death. Mason faced additional charges tied to the attack on Raven Rock and the attempt to destroy the underground facility. Silver Ridge's offices were searched. Operations connected to the contaminated network were suspended. Then came the part nobody in Clearwater Ridge could celebrate. The map had been accurate. Some private wells were contaminated. Several ranches required replacement water systems. Sections of soil needed remediation. Families who had spent years blaming bad luck learned that some of their losses had another explanation. At Miller's Dockside Diner, people stopped talking when Silver Ridge trucks passed outside. The company had built part of the town. That made the truth hurt more, not less. Rachel stood beside her father Henry's photograph when state officials publicly acknowledged that his groundwater complaints had been credible. She did not smile. She simply whispered, You weren't imagining it. Frank was there, so was Ethan. Ranger sat between them. Silver Ridge's seized assets, insurance coverage, and court-controlled funds began feeding a long-term cleanup and compensation program. Nobody promised Clearwater Ridge would be healed in a year. Some damage took decades to create. Repair would take time, too. Spring eventually came to Lake Blackwater. Snow withdrew from the lower hills. The Selkirks remained white above green valleys. Ranch cattle returned to open pasture. And after environmental engineers sealed the contaminated ventilation channels, removed hazardous material, and established permanent monitoring, Ethan was allowed back onto Raven Rock. He was also offered relocation compensation. Enough to leave. This time he considered it. He could buy land somewhere else, a cabin beside another lake, a place with no tunnels, no history, no ghosts. Rachel asked him what he wanted. Ethan looked across the water. I don't know. That answer would once have frightened him. Now it didn't. He waited. Weeks passed. His shoulder healed slowly. Ranger's paw recovered, though the old stiffness in his rear leg remained. On cold mornings, the Malinois took several careful steps before moving normally. Ethan still woke at 3:11 sometimes. He still sat where he could see doors. When fireworks cracked over Clearwater Ridge during a spring festival, his body reacted before his mind could tell it there was no threat. Ranger found him behind the marina, breathing too quickly. The dog leaned against his leg. Ethan placed a hand on his back. I'm here, not cured, not transformed into the man he had been before war, just here. That became enough. By early summer, Ethan made his decision. He stayed. The original cabin could not be safely restored, so most of it was dismantled. Ethan rebuilt on the environmentally cleared side of Raven Rock, using cedar, stone, and wide windows facing the Selkirks. Frank helped rebuild the dock. Rachel complained about Ethan lifting things before his shoulder was ready. Laura arranged permanent protections so no future mineral rights holder could quietly access the island again. For the first time, people regularly came to Raven Rock, and Ethan discovered something unexpected. He didn't hate it. One evening, after everyone left, he stood outside the finished cabin. The door was open. Warm light fell across the porch. Ranger approached, then stopped. Exactly where he had stopped months earlier. Ethan felt his chest tighten. He remembered their first day. The command, Ranger's refusal, the headache, the warm earth. Everything that had followed, because Ethan finally listened. He did not command the dog now. He waited. Ranger lowered his nose, smelled the threshold, then the air inside. He looked toward the forest, back toward Ethan, and walked in. One step, then another. Ethan remained outside. Ranger crossed the room, circled once beside the rebuilt stone fireplace, and lay down. His head rested on his paws. Ethan laughed softly. Okay. He entered. Nothing happened. No metallic taste. No pressure behind his eyes. No warning from Ranger. Only cedar, stone, evening air. Later, Ethan sat on the porch. Across Lake Blackwater, lights appeared one by one in Clearwater Ridge. Months earlier, he would have watched those lights with relief that they were far away. Now he recognized them. Frank's marina, Rachel's clinic, the diner, ranches belonging to people he knew by name. A community he had never intended to join. Ranger rested beside his chair. Ethan scratched the pale scar beneath his right eye. For years, Ethan had believed peace meant finding somewhere distant enough that nobody could reach him. Raven Rock taught him something else. Peace was not disappearing. It was knowing what was worth staying for. Ranger raised his head. Across the lake, the last sunlight touched the snow high in the Selkirks, turning the peaks gold while the water below became almost black. Ethan looked toward the rebuilt cabin glowing behind them. 37 years, 4 owners, 1 missing caretaker, an island nobody could keep. Now Ethan finally understood the reason nobody had lived there. They had never been meant to. For decades, fear, sickness, pressure, and carefully encouraged rumors had protected the secret beneath Raven Rock better than any locked gate could have, until Ranger refused to cross one doorway. That single act had changed everything. The dog had never been afraid of Raven Rock. He had simply known before Ethan did that it wasn't safe. Now Ranger rested without watching the door. Ethan placed his hand on the dog's scarred head. The mountain lake stretched toward Clearwater Ridge, and for once, Ethan did not look away from the lights. The island nobody could live on had finally become a home, not because Ethan Cole conquered it, but because the one companion who had followed him through war, loss, silence, and every broken road afterward had loved him enough to refuse when following him would have been wrong. If you believe loyalty sometimes means refusing to leave someone behind, type yes in the comments. And tell us if you would have stayed on Raven Rock after learning the truth. And if stories about loyalty, justice, and ordinary people standing their ground still mean something to you, subscribe and stay with us for the next story.